Welcome back to another edition of Literary Distracts. Today we have Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, versus Steven Spielberg, the director of the movie The Color Purple. First, I want to shout out the brilliant filmmaker Justin Simeon, who inspired this video and who you should all be following on here if you're not already. In one of his TikTok videos, he puts forward a really astute argument concerning the necessary but often overlooked intersections between Black liberation and queer visibility, and points to Alice Walker's The Color Purple as an example. You should absolutely check that out. Anyways, this controversy between Walker and Spielberg, which took place in the 1980s, hits on some still very relevant topics, including the politics of representation, the role of identity in adaptation, and popular culture's just sort of general erasure of Black sexuality, in this case, queer Black women's sexuality. It's important to first couch all of this discussion within the very necessary context that Alice Walker is a queer Black female writer. And if you've read The Color Purple, then you know it to be a novel that places at its center Black women navigating patriarchal articulations of domesticity and heteronormativity. This representation is at times deliberately uncomfortable, including depictions of abuse that we see from the character of Mr., the husband of the main character Seeley. Importantly, as this will play a major role later, the book also includes a very intimate lesbian relationship between the characters of Seeley and Shug Avery. Upon the novel's release in 1982, there was quite a lot of criticism, with some criticizing what they perceived to be harmful and stereotypical depictions of Black men, and others taking aim at the novel's queer eroticism. For instance, some critics decried what they saw as the novel's rampant female chauvinism or pseudo-feminist axe grinding. And the writer Ishmael Reed, no stranger to controversy himself, called the book, quote, a near criminal assault on Black family life and heterosexual relationships. But none of these criticisms really impeded the novel's success, as it would go on to win both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. And so naturally, Hollywood took notice of this success. However, Alice Walker was initially very reluctant to have her book adapted into a film, because she was rightfully suspicious of Hollywood's track record when it comes to portrayals of both women and people of color. However, in private conversations with friends, she became gradually assured that the best way to advocate for these marginalized communities was through the system itself, and so agreed to the film so long as she could be involved, which included final approval of the director and the script, and ensuring that 50% of the production team represented these marginalized communities. Alice Walker herself even served as a dialect coach, helping the actors such as Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg in adopting Southern African American vernacular English. However, just because Alice Walker had final approval of the script, for instance, this does not mean that she had final approval of the film's final version. Those are two very different things. Also involved in the production was famed music producer Quincy Jones, who approached Steven Spielberg to see if he'd be interested in directing, as Steven Spielberg was a just huge director at this time. Initially, Spielberg was incredibly wary of the project. For one thing, he felt his knowledge of the Deep South, which is where the book is located, was just woefully lacking, and he also acknowledged that a director of color might be best for this film. Famously, when he raised this concern to Quincy Jones, Jones replied, quote, "Did you have to be an alien to direct E.T.?" As for Walker herself, she was also not crazy about the idea of Spielberg directing the film, but she came around to it herself when she watched E.T., which evidently impressed her. Spielberg ended up accepting the job, and perhaps as a reflection of his wariness when it came to his limitations as a white director directing a Black film, he very publicly hedged his authority by declining his usual rate of $15 million, insisting instead upon the industry minimum of $40,000. As Steven Spielberg would later describe his involvement with Alice Walker during the filming, quote, "Alice was on set every day, and Alice was very quiet on the set." Let's call that foreshadowing. While the film was, by most measures, a success, including many Oscar nominations, none of which it actually received, though, it was nonetheless the subject of quite a bit of controversy from civil rights activists, commentators, and film critics, and Alice Walker herself, who later said of Spielberg's adaptation, quote, "When I first saw the movie, I had a headache for a long time." We'll get more into Walker's critique of Spielberg's adaptation, but the initial controversy itself was just really mixed, with some taking issue with depictions that were already present in the novel, while others took issue with things left out. For instance, the NAACP took issue with the film's stereotypical portrayals of Black males. Others said it diluted any kind of feminist message in favor of sentimentality. Remember, though, the novel was already the subject of very similar critiques. But on the other side of all of this, the writer James Baldwin accused the movie and Steven Spielberg of mangling the poetic vision of The Color Purple. One item that was most definitely mangled in the adaptation was the softening of the lesbian relationship between Celie and Shug Avery, in effect erasing the true intimacy of that relationship almost entirely. Presented with this critique, Spielberg responded, quote, "I have always copped to that. I made the movie I wanted to make from Alice Walker's book. Alice was on the set a lot of the time and could have always stepped forward to say, you know, this is too Disney. This is not the way I envisioned the scene going down. She was very supportive during filmmaking, and so I felt that we were doing a good job adapting her novel. There were certain things in the lesbian relationship between Shug Avery and Celie that were finely detailed in Alice's book that I didn't feel could get a PG-13 rating. And I was shy about it. In that sense, perhaps I was the wrong director to acquit some of the more sexually honest encounters between Shug and Celie because I did soften those. I basically took something that was extremely erotic and very intentional, and I reduced it to a simple kiss. I got a lot of criticism for that. While Walker certainly took issue with the erasure of the queerness that is central to the novel, Walker also had other critiques. In one, she explains that Spielberg had taken certain liberties for humorous effect. For instance, in the novel, Celie decides to start making pants, a decision that marks a sort of striving towards her own economic liberation. But in the film, it's depicted with Celie making these kind of overlarge and ill-fitting pants. And Alice Walker said in 2018 that this, quote, had made Celie's industry into something funny for laughs, and that hurt. But what seems to have bothered Walker the most, in addition to the erasure of the novel's queerness, was Spielberg's depiction of the family unit, noting, quote, "In the movie, you know, Mr. is not on the porch at the end of the movie. He's outside the family. But in the book, they end up on the same porch. Everybody has come back to the same house, and they're talking and having a picnic. A family can go through all kinds of horrendous changes, and people can be all messed up and weird, and they can be mean and be drunkards, and for decades. And the next time you see them, they might have stopped drinking. Families really can reconnect, and I think we need to have more faith that that is possible." This, I felt, was a real serious negative of the film. It showed a lack of faith in our ability as a black family to come back together that I personally don't have. What's interesting to me about this is that Walker seems to be both critiquing the film, but also critiquing those earlier critics of the novel who took issue with what they believed to be her unfair depictions of the black men of the novel as being somehow irredeemable. And while you may be thinking, well, if Alice Walker had ensured her involvement with the film, then why didn't she stop what she saw to be these problems? To which I would say that Alice Walker is a novelist and Steven Spielberg was one of the world's biggest directors. Even were we to mistakenly set aside race and its corresponding privilege in this discussion, I think it's totally reasonable that Alice Walker would have put enormous trust in Spielberg during the process of filmmaking, and her disappointment in the final product is in no way contradictory, at least not in my eyes. Also, while there was a new version of The Color Purple that came out in 2023, one which does include more direct confrontation with the novel's central queerness than does the earlier film, it nonetheless remains much more sanitized than the novel itself. And while Spielberg himself has stood by the decisions that he made in that original film, it nonetheless provokes questions of the at times contentious relationship between a novel and its adaptation, but also the relationship between identity and storytelling more generally, or particularly how identity ought to be factored into the telling of a story, the retelling of a story, or the adaptation of a story within a different medium. So let me know in the comments your thoughts on the matter.